My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I feel it's important to begin with that formality, to ground what I'm about to say in the bedrock of a life that was, until recently, defined by logic, evidence, and peer-reviewed fact. I am, or was, a linguistic anthropologist, a man who has dedicated 30 years to the study of moribund languages, the dying whispers of entire cultures. My work is a patient, methodical process of listening, documenting, and preserving. I deal in the ghosts of words, the echoes of forgotten syntax. I have spent months in the most remote corners of the globe, sitting with the last speakers of a language, my digital recorder their sole confidant. I have always believed that the world is an entirely knowable place, that every mystery is simply a puzzle, waiting for the right key, the right analytical framework. I now know how profoundly, how terrifyingly wrong I was. My magnum opus, the work that was to be the culmination of my career, was a comparative study of pre-Columbian proto-languages in North America. It was a dense, complex undertaking, requiring a level of concentration that was impossible to achieve amidst the constant, low-level hum of university life, the emails, the faculty meetings, the endless parade of students asking for extensions. To complete it, I needed absolute solitude. After a lengthy search, I found what I believed to be the perfect sanctuary: a small, modern cabin rented for 6 months, nestled deep within a vast, privately owned forest reserve in the Pacific Northwest. The cabin was my fortress of solitude. It was miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a long, winding gravel road that was more of a suggestion than a thoroughfare. It had no neighbors, no cell service, and a satellite internet connection I used sparingly, only to upload data and correspond with my publisher. The structure itself was a marvel of minimalist design, all clean lines, polished concrete floors, and a single, immense picture window that looked out uninterrupted sea of ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks. For the first 2 months, it was idyllic. My work progressed at a pace I hadn't thought possible. The silence was a physical presence, a thick, comforting blanket that allowed my mind to wander through the intricate pathways of lost vocabularies. I fell into a simple, productive rhythm. I would work from sunrise until dusk, fueled by black coffee and the thrill of academic discovery. As the sun dipped below, the jagged line of the distant mountains, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, I would close my laptop. My ritual to mark the end of the workday was a late night walk. There was a narrow trail that began just beyond the cabin's small wooden deck, winding its way for a few miles through the dense woods before looping back. These walks were my meditation. Armed with a powerful flashlight, I would step into the profound darkness of the forest. The air, crisp and smelling of damp earth and pine, was a tonic. The sounds were a familiar, soothing symphony. The gentle sigh of the wind through the high branches, the scuttling of some small, unseen creature in the undergrowth, the occasional, mournful call of a distant owl. It was a world of predictable, natural patterns. In this controlled environment, I felt completely safe, the master of my small, isolated domain. The forest was not something to be feared. It was an extension of my workspace. A quiet, living library in which I could clear my head and organize my thoughts. This feeling of absolute safety, of intellectual and physical control, was the foundation of my world. And it was the first thing to be taken from me. The night it began was no different from any other. It was a clear, moonless night in late autumn, the stars a brilliant, cold spray across the black canvas of the sky. I was about a mile down the trail, my flashlight beam cutting a clean, white tunnel through the darkness. I had stopped to admire the intricate lace of a spider's web, glistening with dew in the light when I heard it. It was a sound that did not belong. It was not the sound of an animal, nor was it the wind. It was a faint, dry whisper, click, seske keek. It was a complex sound layered with a sibilant, breathy quality followed by a series of sharp, staccato clicks, like a grasshopper's leg rubbing against dry parchment, but deeper, more resonant. It was rhythmic, but unnaturally so, too precise for any biological function I could imagine. My first rational thought was that it was some sort of mechanical failure in my flashlight, perhaps a short in the wiring. I switched it off. The sound continued, now clearer in the absolute darkness and silence. Seski, ki seski, kiku. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, off the trail, deep in the impenetrable blackness of the trees. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears. The sound was maddeningly hard to place. At times it seemed to come from my left, then from my right, as if the source were moving with impossible speed. My academic mind immediately began cycling through possibilities. A species of insect I was unfamiliar with, some nocturnal bird with an unusual call, but the sound had a quality that felt artificial. It was too clean, too structured. I turned my flashlight back on, the beam seeming to push back, a physical weight of darkness. I swept the light across the wall of trees, the beam catching on the rough bark of ancient trunks and the slick, wet surfaces of fallen leaves. Nothing. The forest was still and silent, save for that one intrusive sound. A prickle of unease. An unfamiliar sensation traced a cold line down my spine. This was an anomaly, a data point that didn't fit. For a man who prided himself on understanding the world through categorization and analysis, it was deeply unsettling. I told myself it was absurd to be frightened. I was a scientist. I was in a forest. Forests made strange noises. To be scared was to give in to the kind of primitive, superstitious thinking I had spent my life studying from a safe, academic distance. I decided to continue my walk, a small act of defiance against this burgeoning, irrational fear. But the meditative quality was gone. Every nerve was on high alert. I was no longer an observer. I felt observed. The whisper, click sound remained, a constant, unnerving companion. It never grew louder, but it never faded, either. It seemed to pace me, keeping a consistent distance, always just beyond the reach of my light. Then, it changed. I had stumbled on a root, catching myself at the last moment, and muttering a quiet curse under my breath. Damn it. A few seconds later, the sound from the darkness shifted. It was no longer just the whisper, click, woven into it, distorted, and high-pitched was a chillingly accurate mimicry of my own word, stretched and pulled like audio tape. Emit, sis kkk. I froze, the blood drained from my face, and my heart hammered against my ribs with a force that made me feel dizzy. That was not an animal. That was not the wind. That was intelligent. It had heard me, and it had responded. The mimicry wasn't perfect, it was warped. Filtered through the same strange, static, like quality as the clicking. But it was undeniably my voice. The pretense of scientific curiosity evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear I hadn't felt since I was a small child, afraid of the monster under my bed. I turned and began walking back toward the cabin, my pace quick, just shy of a run. I didn't want to run. Running felt like an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that I was prey. But my legs wanted to flee, to carry me as fast as they could away from that mocking, impossible sound. The sound followed. It seemed to dance around me, in the darkness, a phantom presence that was everywhere and nowhere at once. It continued its horrifying mimicry, replaying the single word I had uttered, twisting it into new and more grotesque forms. Amit, sis, damn, kiki. The walk back to the cabin, a journey that usually took 15 minutes, felt like an hour-long ordeal. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was acutely aware of my isolation, of the miles of empty wilderness that separated me from any other human being. My sanctuary had become a trap. When the warm, yellow light of the cabin's window finally pierced the darkness, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees washed over me. I burst out of the tree line, scrambled up the 3 steps to the deck, and fumbled with the door handle. I slammed it shut behind me, my hand shaking as I shot the deadbolt home. The heavy thud of the lock was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. I stood with my back pressed against the door, my chest heaving, listening. The whisper, click was gone. Inside the solid, lit walls of my cabin, there was only silence. I tried to steady my breathing, to force the rational part of my brain to reassert control. It was a hallucination, an auditory illusion brought on by fatigue and isolation. The human brain is notoriously unreliable, prone to finding patterns in random noise. That had to be it. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only one that would allow me to sleep, to continue my work, to believe that my world was still governed by the laws of physics and not by some whispering, mocking thing in the woods. But as I stood there, trying to convince myself, a cold, heavy certainty settled in the pit of my stomach. What I had heard was real, and it was still out there in the darkness, listening. The following day, I tried to immerse myself in my work, but the incident from the previous night had left a residue, a sticky film of unease that clung to my thoughts. The whisper, click sound replayed itself in my mind, an unwelcome and persistent echo. I found myself staring out the large window for long stretches, my eyes scanning the dense, unmoving wall of trees. Every gust of wind that rattled a loose branch, every shadow that shifted with the passing clouds, snagged my attention. My fortress of solitude was starting to feel like a surveillance post, and I was the sole, unnerved watchman. My academic discipline, usually a source of comfort, now became a tool for obsession. I spent 2 hours online, using the satellite internet I was only supposed to use for uploading research data, searching for esoteric acoustic phenomena. I typed in search terms that felt increasingly unhinged: binaural auditory events in forests, unexplained insectoid, humanoid vocalizations, acoustic anomalies in remote locations. The results were, of course, useless. I found articles about the hum, discussions of tinnitus, and forums filled with ghost stories. Nothing from a credible, scientific source. Nothing that could explain what I had heard. This lack of an explanation was more frustrating than frightening. It was a puzzle without pieces, a data point that refused to fit into any known model. My rational mind rebelled against it. By evening, I had convinced myself that the only way to resolve this cognitive dissonance was through empirical testing. I would repeat the experiment. I would take the same walk at the same time and prove to myself that what I had heard was a one-time neurological fluke. It was a foolish decision, born of intellectual pride. A scientist's arrogant need to tame the anomalous. As I stepped onto the trail that night, the forest felt different. The familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of watchfulness. The air was heavy, the silence thick with unspoken potential. I was hyper-vigilant, my senses straining against the darkness beyond my flashlight's beam. The walk was no longer a meditation, it was an investigation. The first sign of wrongness was the boulder. About a half-mile in, there was a large, granite boulder covered in a thick carpet of dark green moss, a landmark I had noted on my very first walk. Tonight, one entire side of it was bare, scraped clean down to the pale, raw stone. Long, deep gouges, running parallel to each other, marred its surface, as if something immense and incredibly hard had dragged itself against it. There were no tracks around the boulder, no sign of heavy machinery. It was simply damaged. I ran my fingers over the grooves. They felt unnervingly fresh. I pushed on, my heart now a low, anxious drum in my chest. A few hundred yards further, I saw tracks in the soft earth of the path. Deer tracks. But they were wrong. A set of 4 tracks was clearly imprinted in the mud. And then, nothing. They just stopped. They didn't veer off into the undergrowth, nor were there signs of a scuffle, a predator's attack, or the frantic scattering of a panicked animal. The tracks simply ceased to exist mid-stride, as if the deer had been plucked straight up into the sky. It was at that moment, as I stood staring at the impossible tracks, that I heard the sound again. It was closer this time, clearer. The same sibilant whisper, the same dry clicking. But this time, it had a new element. A minute by a branch that had snagged my jacket. I had muttered to myself, "Just get a grip, Alistair." The sound that now echoed in the clearing was a perfect, distorted mimicry of my own voice, wrapped in that alien static. Grip, Alistair's, Heskekiki. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was intelligent. It was listening. And it was mocking me. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail. I just crashed through the undergrowth. Branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line and saw the reassuring geometric shape of the cabin. I fumbled with the lock, slammed the door behind me, and threw the deadbolt. My back pressed against the solid wood, I slid to the floor, gasping for air. For a long time, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing. The silence returned. Inside the cabin, with its locked doors and solid walls, a sliver of hope began to return. I was safe. It was outside, and I was inside. A false, foolish hope. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping on the roof, directly above my head. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the sound of rain or a falling pine cone. It was deliberate, patient. It had the weight and cadence of a single, heavy finger drumming on the metal roofing. It was a sound designed for psychological attrition, a message that the walls I was hiding behind were meaningless. It went on for what felt like an eternity, an hour or more, a steady, maddening percussion that vibrated through the structure of the cabin and into my bones. Eventually, my thirst overrode my terror. My throat was sandpaper. I forced myself to my feet and crept into the small kitchen area to get a glass of water. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the faucet. As the glass filled, my eyes were drawn to the back door. A simple slab of wood with a small window at the top. And that's when I saw it. From the thin gap between the bottom of the door and the hardwood floor, something was retracting. It was a finger, but it was pale, almost luminous white, and impossibly long. It was segmented into 3 joints, like an insect's leg, and ended in a sharp, black nail. It moved with a slow, fluid grace, pulling back out of sight into the darkness on the other side of the door. The tapping on the roof had been a distraction. It was already in. The horror was no longer outside. It had breached my final sanctuary, and I was locked inside with it. The sight of that retreating finger shattered the last remnants of my composure. A primal, wordless scream tore from my throat. My mind, the analytical engine I had relied on my entire life, simply shut down, replaced by a flood of pure, unreasoning terror. I scrambled away from the back door, my limbs feeling clumsy and disconnected. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the heavy wooden dining table and, with a strength I didn't know I possessed, shoved it against the door, wedging it under the handle. I did the same with a bookshelf against the front door. I was a cornered animal, building a pathetic barricade against an incomprehensible predator. The patient tapping on the roof had stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, one that seemed to be circling the cabin. It was a low, guttural clicking, a wet, throaty sound that was utterly alien. It was the sound of something large and predatory, and it was methodically testing the perimeter of my cage. I grabbed the only thing in the cabin that could possibly serve as a weapon, a heavy, black iron fire poker from the hearth. I held it in a white, knuckled grip, its weight a small, cold comfort against the overwhelming dread. Then, with a soft pop and a fizz, the lights went out. The generator had been cut. I was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light was the weak, dying beam of the phone I'd left on the counter, its battery indicator blinking a fatal red. The blackness was total, a physical presence that swallowed the familiar shapes of the room. My world shrank to the small, trembling circle of light in my hand. The clicking outside stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a loaded, waiting silence. A sound ripped through the quiet. The sharp, explosive shattering of glass. It came from the living room. The large picture window, my beautiful view of the forest, had been broken. It was inside. I didn't scream this time. The sound was trapped in my throat. I backed away, crab walking into the darkest corner of the cabin, and squeezed myself into a small coat closet, pulling the door shut until only a thin crack remained. I tried to control my breathing, certain that its ragged, panicked sound was a deafening beacon. I heard it moving through the cabin. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was a strange, arrhythmic skittering, a combination of a heavy weight being dragged in the light, rapid movement of multiple limbs. It was too heavy for an insect, too light and fast for a man. It moved with a terrifying confidence in the dark, a master of its environment, while I was a blind, helpless intruder. Then it began to speak. It used the whisper, click voice. But now it was cycling through phrases from my own research recordings. Fragments of dead and forgotten languages. The sacred work to which I had dedicated my life were being twisted into a horrifying new form. A phrase from a Potawatomi lament. A word from a Cherokee blessing. A question from a Navajo dialect. All spoken in that distorted, chittering voice. It wasn't random. It was calling to me, using the ghosts of my own work as a lure. The skittering stopped directly outside the closet. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. The door swung open. I pointed my phone's failing light at it. It was tall, impossibly so. Its form hunched to fit beneath the cabin's ceiling. Its limbs were long and thin, bending at angles that defied anatomy. Its skin was the pale, waxy white of a corpse or a cave-dwelling insect. Its face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless plate of cartilage devoid of eyes, nose, or ears. But it had a mouth, a thin, vertical slit that ran from where its forehead should be to its chin. As I watched, the slit widened, opening like a wound to reveal rows of needle, like black teeth. This was it, the moment of my death, the hero at the mercy of the monster. But it didn't attack. It stood there, its featureless face aimed at me, and the whisper, click sound it made was different now. The mocking tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded like urgency. It raised one of its long, three-jointed fingers, but it didn't point at me. It pointed past me, toward the shattered window and the black forest beyond. It spoke one more word, a word I knew intimately. A word from a lost Amazonian language I had spent 6 months documenting. It was a word that had no direct translation, but meant, roughly, listen to the sound that makes. Akacha. And then I did listen. Pushing past the frantic drumming of my own heart, I heard it. A new sound coming from the forest. It wasn't a click or a whisper. It was a hum. A deep, resonant bass frequency. so low it was felt more than heard. It vibrated through the floorboards, up my legs, and into my teeth, making them ache. The cabin itself seemed to groan under the pressure of the sound. It was a sound of immense, geological power, the sound of a world ending. The creature in front of me shuddered violently. A high-pitched, keening noise escaped its vertical mouth, and for the first time I understood. The sounds it had been making, the mimicry, the chittering, it wasn't aggression. It was terror. This thing hadn't broken into my cabin to hunt me. It had broken in to hide. The hum from outside intensified, reaching an unbearable crescendo. The creature convulsed, its long limbs thrashing. It collapsed to the floor with a sickening, wet crunch, like a giant insect being crushed. Then the hum stopped. Silence. I was alone, trapped in a dark, remote cabin with the shattered remains of a window, a dead thing on the floor, and the certain knowledge that the real monster, the thing that had terrified and destroyed this one, was still out there in the woods, and now it knew exactly where I was. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, I didn't move. I remained huddled in the closet. My phone's light, having finally died, leaving me in absolute blackness with the cooling corpse of the creature. The silence that followed the hum was different from any I had known before. It was not empty, it was heavy, expectant. It felt like the held breath of something colossal, something that had exerted itself and was now listening, waiting. That thought, the idea of being listened to by the source of that sound, was what finally broke my paralysis. Survival instinct. A primal force I had only ever read about took over. I didn't think, I just acted. I scrambled out of the closet, not daring to look at the shape on the floor. I stumbled through the dark, my hands outstretched, until I found the wall. I felt my way to the front door, to my pathetic barricade. With frantic, clumsy movements, I pulled the bookshelf away. I wrenched the deadbolt open and threw myself out into the cold night air. I ran. I ran without a flashlight, without a destination, without a single thought in my head other than away. I ran through the dark forest, tripping over roots, crashing through unseen bushes, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The fear of what I might see was far greater than the fear of running blind. I have no idea how long I ran for, or how far. My memory of it is a chaotic blur of pain, panic, and the percussive sound of my own heart. I just ran until my legs gave out from under me, and I collapsed onto the cold, hard asphalt of the main road, miles from the cabin. I was found at dawn by a truck driver on his morning route. He told me later that he thought he'd hit a deer. He found me curled in a fetal position on the side of the road, shivering, incoherent, my face and arms latticed with scratches. I was suffering from shock and exposure. The weeks that followed are a haze of hospital rooms, police interviews, and psychiatric evaluations. I tried to tell them what happened. I spoke of the whisper click, the scraped boulder, the creature in the cabin, the bone-shaking hum. They listened with professional patience, nodding and taking notes. Their conclusion was unanimous. I had suffered a severe psychotic break, brought on by the stress of my work and the prolonged isolation. A fugue state. My mind, they said, had created a complex, terrifying narrative to cope with an underlying psychological collapse. There was no evidence to support my story. When the police went to the cabin, they found it undisturbed, save for a broken window they attributed to a bear. The furniture was not barricading the doors. There was no dead creature on the floor. My fire poker was in its stand by the hearth. My story was dismissed as the ravings, a brilliant but broken man. I was encouraged to take an extended leave of absence from the university. My book, my life's work, sits unfinished on a hard drive. I can't bring myself to open. I abandoned my research, my career, my entire life. The man who went into that forest, the rational, evidence-based academic, did not come out. I did. I live in the city now. I chose the loudest, busiest part of it I could find. My apartment is on a major thoroughfare, and the sounds of traffic, sirens, and people are a constant 24-hour symphony. I need the noise. I cannot bear the silence. Silence is no longer an absence of sound. For me, it is a canvas. It is the space where other sounds can be heard. I have developed a severe case of phonophobia, a fear of specific sounds. But it's more than that. It's a fear of the quiet that allows those sounds to exist. I am writing this all down. Now, not because I expect you to believe me. I have made my peace with being disbelieved. I am writing this because it is the only thing I have left. It is an attempt to take the chaotic, terrifying data points of my experience and arrange them into a logical, linear narrative. It is the last act of a scientist trying to make sense of the senseless. Or perhaps it is a warning. The worst part is not the memory of the creature's featureless face or its insect-like finger. The human mind, for all its fragility, can eventually file away even the most traumatic images. The worst part is the sound, the hum. The memory of that deep, world-unmaking vibration has become the foundation of my fear. Sometimes, late at night, in the brief lulls between passing trucks and distant sirens, I think I can hear it. It's just at the lowest registers of my hearing. A faint thrumming that makes the fillings in my teeth ache. I don't know if it's real, or if it's just the echo of a memory, a form of auditory PTSD. That uncertainty is the cruelest torture. Is it just a ghost in my own mind? Or is the source of that sound still out there, listening for me across the miles? Is it patient? Is it waiting? I don't know the answers. All I know is that I have to keep the noise turned up. I have to drown out the quiet, because the silence is where it lives. And I'm beginning to run out of noise.